Sailing an Allied ship in the Arctic was a death trap. Either it was sunk or it capsized, and if someone fell overboard, they were left behind. But why did the Allies do these missions, and how did the Arctic turn into a ship graveyard, with even more casualties than the U-boat? This is the dark truth about the Arctic convoy death runs. By 1941, the Germans had made big strides in Europe. Poland fell in 1939, swiftly followed a year later by France. Yet Adolf Hitler was eyeing the East, seeing the Soviet Union as the best place to gain Lebensraum, or living space for his people. So, on June 22nd, Operation Barbarossa was launched. More than 3.8 million Axis troops invaded the 1,800-mile front on the western side of the Soviet Union. They stormed the front lines, taking plenty of territory, resulting in thousands of casualties on both sides of the battlefield. But the Wehrmacht was in complete control, cutting off Soviet supply lines and putting the country under siege with repeated bombing sorties. The Soviets needed support, and they needed it yesterday. Yet there was one lifeline. Great Britain was not willing to see the Soviet Union fall, and just about a month into the invasion, the British and Soviets formed the Anglo-Soviet Agreement, with the aim of keeping its new ally in the war. However, sending aid and supplies to the Soviets was not going to be easy, and there was only one realistic way to make this possible. Before even attempting to send supplies via ships, both the Soviets and British began a joint occupation of Iran, where they quickly tried to neutralize the effect of German influence. Supplies began running through Iran, where the British could safely hand it over to the Soviets, who in turn would move it back into the country and then the front lines. By September of the same year, and following the Second Inter-Allied Conference, the United States, through its Lend-Lease Act, would begin to send supplies, but only to Britain, from where they would be distributed to the Soviets. In fact, Britain would repay their debt to the United States for more than half a century, only making the final payment in December 2006. Nevertheless, having supplies from the United States made things a little easier. More supplies were coming in, and many of these were of exceptional quality that could theoretically change the outcome of the war. Yet going through Iran would prove problematic for the quantities needed by the Soviets, and the only other real option was going through the Arctic. By August 1941, the Allies launched Operation Dervish, which started in Hvalfjord, Iceland, with the main goal of shipping supplies to Murmansk. Yet this would immediately prove impossible, and even on the first mission, the convoy was diverted to Arkhangelsk, about 400 miles to the east. The Allies feared Luftwaffe raids, but even on this first mission, the Allies ran into problems of their own. The plan was that British ships would escort the vessels midway, before being met by the Soviets, who'd take over. Within weeks, they'd reach the Russian ports, unloading tanks, jeeps, weaponry, supplies, and various other military hardware. The early missions proved a massive success, with more than 100 Allied vessels safely traversing the Murmansk run by the end of 1941. Only 2 had been lost. It seemed like the route was clear, and many Germans even considered the aid being passed to the Soviets as unimportant. Moreover, the British had started its own campaigns destroying the German Navy, and by the end of 1941, only the battleship Tirpitz, the battlecruiser Scharnhorst, the heavy cruisers Admiral Hipper, Prinz Engen, Admiral Scheer, and Lützow, accompanied by 4 light cruisers, were available to the Kriegsmarine. They'd taken massive losses in the Atlantic, yet below the surface, an even more terrifying weapon was lurking. After almost a year of virtually free passage through the Arctic, the Germans realized that what was making it to Soviet shores was proving a real problem for the Wehrmacht. They needed to stop these convoys. So in April 1942, a German U-boat was patrolling along the Arctic, when convoy QP-10 departed from Murmansk to Reykjavik. It was a convoy of 16 ships, made up of the HMS Liverpool, 4 destroyers, the minesweeper Speedwell, and the trawlers Blackfly and Painter. On its flank were 4 Soviet vessels, but even this didn't prove enough. On the morning of April 11, 1942, a group of Ju-88 bombers appeared out of nowhere. They began raining down bombs on the Allied convoy, with the merchant vessel, Empire Crowder, being hit by 3 500-pound bombs, while 2 more lit up the vessel as it was being evacuated. 1 German Ju-88 was also shot down. Then it got even worse when the following day, the German destroyers Hermann Schumann, Z-24, and Z-25 set out to find the convoy. Miraculously, they failed, But as it was exiting Soviet waters, another big problem was lurking in the waters below. Then, at approximately 1 a.m. on the morning of April 13th, it awakened. The German U-boat U-435 fired its first torpedo, downing the Russian freighter Kiev before disappearing into the frigid waters. Less than 3 hours later, at 3:30, it struck again, this time downing the El Occidente, which sank almost immediately. And by 5 a.m., Ju-88s were back, circling the convoy like sharks and engaging with strafing runs. Yet they were fended off, and the rest of the convoy safely made it back to Reykjavik. But this was shots fired, and the Germans were now actively seeking these convoys, trying to wipe them out before even getting close to Soviet soil. The Germans moved vessels like the Tirpitz to harbors in Norway, where they could continuously monitor the waterways for these convoys, and the Allies had no real option but to continue sacrificing. With the Allies continuing to lose more and more vessels, plans changed. The winters were favored for the extra length of the darkness over the Arctic, but even with the advantage of cover, the conditions also took a toll. The temperatures were frigid, the winds strong, and the waves sometimes 25 meters high, while each wave of seawater immediately froze to the ship's upper surfaces. It became so heavy that if it wasn't chipped away immediately, the vessel would capsize. Yet chipping away at the ice was a challenge all by itself. The deck was slippery, and the wind was icy, and getting equipment to the ice proved even more of a challenge. What was even more terrifying was the fact that these convoys had orders: stop for nothing or nobody. It meant that even if someone slipped on the icy deck and fell into the frigid waters of the Arctic, they would be left to freeze to death. It became so intense that one Allied sailor even wrote a poem about it. Draw the blanket of ocean over the frozen face. He lies, his eyes quarried by glittering fish, staring through the green, freezing sea glass at the northern lights. He is now a child in the land of Christmas, watching, amazed, the white, tumbling bears and the diving seal. The iron wind clangs round the ice caps, the five-pointed dog star burns over the silent sea, and the three ships come sailing in. But the support for the Soviets continued, with hundreds of missions daily between the Allies and the Soviets, and the Germans picking them off like ducks floating in a pond. And when the staggering number of casualties was revealed, it painted a very dark picture. The battles in the Arctic massively favored the Germans, and despite more than 4 million tons of aid and supplies making it to Soviet shores, the Allies lost 104 merchant vessels and another 16 warships to the bottom of the ocean. On the German side, the casualties weren't any better, with 30 submarines and 4 warships finding their home at the bottom of the Arctic. Dozens of Ju-88 bombers also perished in trying to take down these convoys. As for the human casualties, about 3,000 Allied servicemen, including 1,900 Royal Navy sailors, lost their lives in these missions. Yet, on the Soviet side, also about 30 vessels were left at the bottom of the ocean, with hundreds of human casualties adding to the ever-rising death toll. But the question remains, was it worth it? And what would have happened if they didn't make these sacrifices? It remains a question forever embedded in the history of the Soviet Union. Following Operation Barbarossa, Germany made many initial gains, driving the Soviets back all the way to Stalingrad. In fact, Hitler planned on taking Moscow and seeing the fall of Stalin. He was even making big strides in changing this into a reality. Meanwhile, the Soviets were continuing to take losses, and more importantly, most of their air force had been wiped out by the Germans. It became impossible for factories to keep up with the large demand for supplies, and when they were discovered, the Germans either bombed or sabotaged them. And when Germany took over most of the agricultural land, they were ready to starve the Soviets. Historians all agree that had it not been for these deadly convoys, and particularly the United States Lend-Lease program, Nazi Germany would have destroyed the Soviet Union, and with it, the fall of Moscow. By sheer luck and arrogance from Hitler himself in the siege of Stalingrad, the tide of the battle changed. Thousands of Allied weaponry and armor were now helping the Soviets, who managed to comfortably drive back the Nazi advance. They'd all combine and finally surround Berlin by 1945, where it was later discovered that Adolf Hitler had taken his own life. But it was the political advantage to the Allies that made these Arctic death runs so valuable. As the Soviets felt the pain of a full German onslaught, Stalin also demanded that the Allies open another war front on the west. He believed that the Germans would be forced to divert some of their troops, yet doing so would have led to an increasing number of casualties. And to show their unwavering support for their Soviet allies, the United States and the United Kingdom simply stepped up these Arctic convoys. It not only bought them time, but lulled the Germans into a false sense of security that perhaps an invasion on the Western Front was not something the Allies were going to risk. Then in June 1944, the Allies struck, launching what would become the famous D-Day landings. It completely crippled the Germans, but that's a topic for another video. In the end, thousands gave their lives to help the Allies win the war and finally defeat fascism. Yet their help would later lead to the Cold War. But at least they could assist in giving the Soviets a shot, something the Night Witches did with no assistance. Check out this video to find out how.